Hey, everybody. This is Patrice Nwuka. Welcome to the Independent Women's Forum's at Center for Economic Opportunity. It's our March policy chat, and we are here talking about Equal Pay Day. Sorry to be a couple minutes late, but we're going to jump right in with my cavalry of experts today. So, my name is Patrice, and Equal Pay Day is today. It's also tomorrow. It was probably yesterday. It's definitely going to be on St. Patrick's Day, on Mother's Day, on July 4th. You get the gist. We think that Equal Pay Day is actually every day. But we hear that women make 82 cents on the dollar that men make. Well, what does that actually mean? And what does it mean when you hear equal pay for equal work? Don't we get that already? One comment I also hear from a lot of senior women, seasoned women, is that if pay discrimination was so rampant, why would women even work to begin with? So we're going to grapple with these questions and more. And as I mentioned, I brought in the cavalry today to help me talk through the pay gap. So Hadley Heath Manning is the director of policy at the Independent Women's Forum. Kelsey Bowler is a senior policy analyst at IWF, and Charlotte Whalen is policy analyst at IWF. Ladies, welcome to the Equal Pay Day chat.
Thanks, Patrice. Thanks for having us.
Terrific. Well, I'm so excited for you guys to be here today because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, myths, and flat out lies that are circulating around about this day. So let's jump right in. And Hadley, I'm going to have you kick it off as our intrepid leader.
Sure.
What is Equal Pay Day? Why do you believe it? What goes into it? Please, let's kick off.
Well, yeah, I believe that women on average earn less money than men on average. And that's kind of the point that Equal Pay Day makes. It's based on the gender gap wage statistic, which is produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and updated each year, which is an average. So it's all the full-time working women, all their earnings average stacked up against the average of full-time working men. And what we find is that women earn about 82 cents on the dollar compared to what men make. However, it's really important to remember that this is a raw comparison of averages. So that means it's not corrected for a number of factors that we know affect the way that people are paid. So for example, what profession you work in to start with. You wouldn't expect a doctor to be paid the same as someone who works as a cosmetologist, for example. You wouldn't expect someone who cleans homes for a living to be paid the same as a lawyer. There's a difference in profession. There's a difference in education. There's a difference in the number of hours that you work. Of course, that's a big one. And what your working conditions are. Men suffer, sadly, a high proportion of workplace injuries and fatalities, showing that men work in more dangerous conditions than women on average. So just keep in mind, it's an average. It doesn't compare equal pay for equal work. It's not apples to apples. It doesn't compare, for example, to social workers who have the same level of education and experience who work the same number of hours per week. When we get down into those nitty-gritty details, we start to see the wage gap shrink and shrink and shrink, and to a certain point disappear.
Anybody else want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I'll just say from personal experience, before I had kids, I worked very long hours, kind of similar work that I do now, writing and media, which requires you to get up super early one morning and then stay up in, past midnight on the same day sometimes. And that role was just unsustainable for me after I became a mom. And I don't think IWF would have any problem with me sharing this, that a huge reason I wanted to come to this organization is because they offered flexibility that my previous employer did not. Now, I personally was willing to actually take a pay cut at a point in my career where a lot of people think you should be going up and up and up. But I think we need to acknowledge that as women, and especially as moms, a lot of us change our priorities as we do get to different levels in our career. And some of us actually choose to lean into a so-called gender pay gap. And if I didn't have the opportunity to do that, to figure out a career that works with my choices and my desires, I actually don't think the economy would be working for me and many women who have different desires, again, especially working mothers.
And Charlotte, I mean, when we think about this kind of equal pay day, do you feel like, I think maybe picking up on Kelsey's point, that women and men maybe start out on the same pay level, the same career trajectory, but then we start to see things shift out over time, or that gap start to increase over time? Or do you think it's just consistent across the board from the start of a career to the end of it?
Oh, I think it's absolutely different. I think that, women and men often start out in a similar area, similar level. If they have the same education, same experience, they have the same opportunities presented, but then they have different priorities. Like, I also have a young child. Hopefully she will stay asleep during this. And if I didn't have flexibility to IWF offers, I don't know I probably couldn't work, frankly, because my husband's in the military and he's going to be deployed. He's going to be gone for various periods of time. And I couldn't hold a full-time job, or I wouldn't want to, frankly. I want to be with my daughter. I want to take care of her. And that's a decision that we've made for our family. But if I didn't have flexibility, if I couldn't have made these choices, I could be earning more somewhere else, probably. Who knows? I haven't tried, frankly, because I don't want to, because IWF is great. But that even so, I just wouldn't have the same flexibility, quality of life, because those are what I value more than just base earnings.
Yeah, I'll jump in here too and say that data bears this out, these anecdotes that we're hearing about many of working moms at IWF, right? But when you look at studies that correct for some of the factors I mentioned, and they focus particularly on young, single, childless workers, they find that the wage gap is very small. In some cases, they actually find a reverse gender wage gap where young, urban, childless women are out earning their male counterparts. That's an interesting phenomenon. We could talk about the role that education is playing in driving some very serious social and economic changes. However, once we reach the age of about 25, 30 years old, that's the age where people start to form families and become parents. It does change the priorities of a lot of working women and working men. In surveys, working fathers suggest that they want full-time jobs, that full-time work is their ideal. Meanwhile, when you survey working mothers, a greater portion of working mothers will say, actually, I prefer part-time work. And of course, again, part-time work and full-time work, we would expect to pay differently regardless of gender. And the last thing I want to add here is that, equal pay day, I think, is worse than meaningless. It's actually misleading, because the suggestion, when you fail to account for the many factors that influence pay between men and women, the suggestion is that we live in a sexist country where employers are out to get women. They're out to shortchange women, and they're intentionally paying women and men who are counterparts at work different wages. That's not really what's reflected in the wage gap statistic. That may be happening in some cases, and that would be illegal. But the vast majority of cases where we look at the factors that are influencing the wage gap, they're factors like the differences I mentioned. And I think even progressive feminists would agree that the wage gap statistic isn't the best metric for what's going on in our economy, because during the COVID pandemic, we saw a lot of women's jobs erased from the economy, as many sectors that provide a lot of female jobs. The social sector was hit very hard because of social distancing protocols and lockdowns and so forth. Men were more likely to be in those so-called essential jobs. They were more likely to stay employed. And so what happened as a result of that? We actually saw the wage gap shrink. And that would suggest that, hey, women are doing great. We're catching up to men's earnings. But that's not what was going on in reality. In reality, more women were actually leaving the labor force. We've reached a 35-year low in terms of women's labor force participation. Those women just aren't captured in the wage gap statistic anymore. And so it looks like women's earnings have caught up to men's. And so again, my point is here, let's leave this statistic alone. It's really not that helpful. It's not worth creating a fake holiday about, and it's not worth spending our time hand-wringing about discrimination.
Well, you hit on a number of great points there, Hadley, and I know so Birdie told me that those are some of the things that were mentioned in a brand new policy focus on Equal Pay Day every day. Charlotte, I know you and Hadley co-authored that the policy focus that folks see on the screen right now. Do you want to just hit some of the other really key points and takeaways that you guys discussed in this white paper?
Absolutely. Hadley really has hit the main points already, I would say. Just that, the raw wage gap really doesn't measure equal pay for equal work. It's not a helpful statistic. It doesn't really reflect, how people are being compensated, whether it's they get more flexibility, women desire more flexibility instead of higher earnings. And I think really the biggest takeaway is that women should be able to make the choices that are best for their lives and their livelihoods. And if that doesn't mean, maximizing their earnings, if that means maximizing family work-life balance, if that means more flexibility, more paid time off, more sick, whatever it is, they should be encouraged to find the best situation for them and for their families. And it shouldn't just be, a concern over a difference between these averages of full-time workers, of men and women, with no other factors taken into account.
Let's pick up a little bit just on the education piece. And Hadley, you mentioned wanting to talk through it more. I'm going to kick it off by posing a question to really myself, which is something we hear very often. We hear about sexism in the workplace. We also hear about racism in the workplace. And apparently women of color, are at the nexus of those two forms of rampant discrimination, according to some in the workplace. And so you have an equal pay day for Black women and a Hispanic equal pay day, a Native American equal pay day, an Asian, well, there may not be an Asian American women's equal pay day for a good reason. And I actually have a blog out this morning that talks about three things to know on equal pay day. And one of which is I explain some of why Black women, Hispanic women, and Native American women have gender pay gaps that seem, or sex-based pay gaps that seem so much bigger than the overall. I believe the numbers for those are around 79 cents, 78 cents, and 71 cents. But, as you guys have been mentioning, you've got to control for those factors. Those factors are choices that women make, and education is one of them. Occupation is another one. And so when we look at where Black women, for example, are Black women and Hispanic women and Native American women, their occupations tend to be on the the end of the lower paying job spectrum, service-based jobs that, as Hadley mentioned, were really vulnerable during the pandemic. So if you're in a low paying job and low paying career to begin with, your wages compared to white men, which is another whole that aspect, not compared to your peers, but to white men, you're going to be lower. However, when you control for those factors, we found, and this was a really great study by payscale.com, that the pay gap for Black women is 98 cents. For Hispanic women, 99 cents, and for Native American women, 99 cents. And then Asian women, which is really interesting, Asian women actually outperform white men when you control for those factors. And they actually start with a smaller pay gap to begin with. So, it's so interesting when we hear about the pay gap overall and the pay gap for women of color, but you got to control for those factors, a lot of which are the choices that we make. And now, Kelsey, I'll kick this to you. Do you feel like every woman has the personal agency to make these types of choices, or are there women who don't? And are there women who truly are discriminated when it comes to sex or race? What do you think?
Well, first off, I want to make it clear that it is already illegal in the United States to discriminate when it comes to pay on race or gender. We have the Equal Pay Act already exists, and you would wonder if this piece of legislation, if it's already been law for so long, since late 1970s, I believe, why aren't there more lawsuits if there's all these injustices happening? And the fact of the matter is, when you actually dig into these statistics, as we've broken down today, this type of discrimination doesn't actually exist. And adding to that, I think it's unfortunate the social pressure that women feel, this girl boss, rah, rah, Sheryl Sandberg, lean in, really makes it difficult for women to take a step back from their careers if they want, because they feel like they are letting society down, they are letting themselves down. When we all, I know we know right here, there's no more important job than inside the home raising the next generation. But I think for our generation, those I know, it's very difficult for them to make that choice. And one of the silver linings of the COVID pandemic, I hope, is that all women and men, for that matter, will have more options for flexible work, for part-time work. And that's what this raw pay gap statistic just fails to capture, the different types of choices and options that are available and hopefully are becoming more available to different workers in the workplace. It should be applauded, I think, when women and moms decide to temporarily take a step back from their careers to prioritize their children. We know these jobs are not easy to raise children, and we shouldn't feel this social shame as women or any parents to take a step back and to become a part of this so-called gender pay gap.
Yeah, I want to jump in here about the illegal nature of sex-based wage discrimination. First of all, if you feel that you have been discriminated against in the workplace due to your sex or your race, you should know that you have rights, and you should know that you can file a complaint with your HR division at work or with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Those complaints do get investigated. They have to be investigated. But I think that sometimes this discussion about equal pay day, particularly when the wage gap statistic is presented without context, and it's presented as if it's suggesting that there's rampant and widespread sex-based wage discrimination, it sends a really bad message to women in the workplace, and particularly to young women who maybe just are entering the workplace or who in their educational years and training to prepare to join the workforce. It sends the message that this is normal, this is commonplace, this is what you should expect. You should expect to be shortchanged. That is not what we should expect as women. This is the United States of America. This is 2022. If someone has been mistreated, we have a legal system in place to respond to that. And thank God we do. We are lucky to be American women, to have the rights that we have and to have the opportunities that we have. And so I just want to be sure that that's very clear. Even the discussion around proposed legislation like the Paycheck Fairness Act sometimes sends the message that it's not yet illegal, that we need to do more, that the government needs to do more to pass legislation to make this abhorrent practice illegal. The good news is,
how can you be against paycheck fairness?
It's one of those laws. It's one of those proposed laws. It's one of those bills with a great name, but the name doesn't really say what it does.
Well, and paycheck fairness is one of those federal proposals that would really empower the federal government to increase oversight over individual workplaces. That's understandable when it comes to ensuring that people are safe on the job. It's very different when it comes to determining how much Maggie makes at work versus how much Tom makes at work. Especially since, as we talked about, Tom, they maybe want two different things. Tom may be willing to work to travel whenever business travel resumes, but he may be willing to go on the road 5 days a week. Maybe Maggie wants to be home at 5:30 to take her kids to soccer practice every day. So expecting a federal bureaucrat to get into the nitty-gritties of determining why their pay may be different, I think seems like a lot of regulatory burden, but also doesn't seem like a good use of time for our federal workforce, or frankly, shouldn't be the government's role to begin with. I mean, what do you guys agree with that?
Well, I think one of the biggest concerns that we should have, particularly as women in the workplace, about the Paycheck Fairness Act is that in response to this piece of legislation, which I believe has good intentions, employers will say, wow, I can't afford to offer Kelsey the opportunity to work from home on Fridays. Maybe that's something she's asked for in exchange for less pay than someone who is willing to come into the office 5 days a week, even though maybe as an employer, that's valuable to me to have somebody there 5 days a week. Different employers are different, right? My husband works at a hospital. He's got to be there. I can work from home. That's the beauty of my job at IWF. But employers are today allowing workers to make trade-offs on an individual level and to say, Patrice, Kelsey, you guys, maybe you work for this organization. We're going to make this employment contract that's suited just to you as an individual based on what you want. We're going to be flexible with you. But in response to legislation like the Paycheck Fairness Act, employers will respond by saying, nope, no options for anybody, no flexibility. It's all going to be extremely standardized because I've got Uncle Sam breathing down my neck, waiting for me to create some kind of pay disparity that's going to look like discrimination. And I can't afford to do that. I can't afford that legal risk. And so I'm not going to offer the flexibility that you might want. And who's that going to hurt the most? It's going to hurt women the most, particularly working moms who place a very high value on flexibility.
And Hadley, I have to correct myself. The Equal Pay Act was enacted in 1963.
Right.
So we have had this law on the books for a very long time, and the burden should be on those advocating for the so-called Paycheck Fairness Act to show us why we need this type of legislation. Why is the Equal Pay Act not enough for women? Are there instances where it's not holding up? And if that were true, if this type of pay discrimination were so prevalent in the workplace, undoubtedly the media would love to tell these stories. They love female victimization stories. And I don't want to discount true victims of pay discrimination, because sadly, we know injustices still occur. But again, we are so privileged as women in the United States to have laws on the books protecting us from this type of discrimination. The burden really should be on those advocating for more government, more regulations of why we need this and why this law that's been on the books for decades now is not enough.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you guys. And to underscore once again, because I know that there are people out there who will say, no, you're saying that there's no discrimination. No, there actually are instances where people are paid unfairly. Women may be paid unfairly. Black people may be paid unfairly, and we want to call it wrong. It's illegal, and it should be prosecuted, or it should be investigated, as Hadley talked about earlier. But we also want to correct the record that it's not necessarily rampant across our entire workplace. Maybe there are specific industries, but to say that to paint our entire workforce and workplace with such a broad brush is it is misleading, and it's wrong. But it's really meant to make us feel like victims. And I got to tell you, I didn't hear it on the news today, probably because there's so many higher pressing issues, but usually it's presented on the news, the local newscast, with the female and the male anchor. And the female anchor is reading about how she's making 83 cents on the dollar that the man who holds the same job is making. And you could just see the tension between the two. And I don't think that tension, that men and women should be considered adversaries in the workplace. And I think things like equal pay day, unfortunately, maybe unintentionally, has the consequence of doing that. So, speaking though of what's going on from a policy standpoint, I understand the White House is going to be celebrating equal pay day this afternoon. And they're hosting some special guests. Some celebrities are coming. Really, they start out as athletes coming, but they've turned into celebrities. But I guess the White House has some efforts to, they believe, close the wage gap when it comes to the federal workforce, as well as the federal contractors. But Kelsey, I believe the women's U.S. soccer team is coming. Can you just kind of get everybody up to speed with what their whole case was about?
Absolutely. Yes. At the White House today, Vice President Kamala Harris is hosting some members from the U.S. Soccer team. I imagine Megan Rapinoe will be there among those present at the White House. And of course, we know that the U.S. women's soccer team sued the United States Soccer Federation in a California federal court, seeking more than $66 million in damages for alleged wage discrimination and discriminatory working conditions. The media loves this story. Megan Rapinoe has become a celebrity, not just a soccer star, but a national celebrity, a Victoria's Secret model who is fighting for equality for women. But what is so frustrating about this case is that a federal court in Los Angeles actually ruled, they dug into this, and because Megan Rapinoe and her teammates had to prove they were being discriminated against. And a federal court actually found they did not engage in unlawful discrimination. They did find sufficient evidence to support that perhaps there was some unequal treatment regarding travel differences, accommodations, medical support between the men's and women's team. But when the judge looked into the core of their lawsuit alleging wage discrimination, they found it did not hold up. And in fact, the women's national soccer team earned $24 million overall, while the men's national soccer team earned only $18 million. And more importantly, why is this? How did this story come to be? Well, the women's national team and the men's national team were paid according to separate collective bargaining agreements that the teams devised separately, and the players were involved in this process. This won't surprise many females in the audience that men actually chose a riskier pay structure. They chose higher risk for higher rewards. So if the team performed well, if they as individuals performed well and ended up on the field playing a lot, they got bigger bonuses. Whereas the women's soccer team chose a more safe contract where they knew exactly how much they would make going into it, which meant less money in terms of bonuses, but they had guaranteed, more guaranteed benefits that the men's team did not prioritize in their bargains. And I kind of laugh at that because we know that the data backs it up that men are bigger risk takers than women. So despite this federal judge finding there was in fact no pay discrimination, the U.S. Soccer Federation actually agreed to settle this lawsuit for $24 million, which goes to show, if the women's team actually had a case to make. They were originally suing for a lot more than that, so you'd think they would pursue it. Nevertheless, they backed down. They agreed to this settlement and a promise to use the same bonus scale for all future female and male competitions. And as our colleague at IWF, Jennifer, who has covered this so deeply,
Sarah.
Yes, as she pointed out, this actually in the long term could hurt women because some women might want to prioritize those extra benefits. They might want those guarantees at the beginning of the season. I'm going to make X amount of money, not I'm going to make X amount of money if we win, if I play. And so these types of equal pay regulations that often we hear the left advocate would ultimately do is sadly take away flexibility and options for women to advocate for themselves. And that's what we're seeing from this U.S. Soccer Federation lawsuit. And it's just, I just have to say, between us, it boggles my mind that the women's national soccer team is still invited to peddle this idea that they are victims when really they profited off of this whole scheme.
But that's between you, me, and Hadley and our viewers. But Kelsey, we're all friends here, and I think I agree with you. And Hadley, as we kind of start to round the corner on our conversation, we've talked about it from the top to the bottom. This F word, flexibility. I mean, I think that's what women really many women maximize at particular points in their career. I shouldn't say every woman, because not every woman is the same, and not every woman is in the same place in their career at the start versus the middle versus the end. Maybe towards when you're looking at retirement and your kids are gone, maybe you do want to maximize your earnings once again. But flexibility and work life, let's talk just a little bit about that. I mean, we in the green room, we were kicking around this idea of what would the world look like with no wage gap. Do you think that would be a place where we have that flexibility and that maximized salary that we want, or just what are your musings on a world with no pay?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a little bit more, and I also appreciated the comment that you made, Patrice, that men and women aren't adversaries. Certainly in the workplace we might compete for the same job, so sometimes we might be competitors, but a lot of times we're collaborating in the workplace. We're working towards a shared mission. And that is true no place more than in our homes. Many men and women share homes, they share families. And my decision maybe to seek out and prioritize flexibility is the flip side of my husband's choice to lean in at work and maximize his pay. I think men feel in many cases pressure to provide for their families. And we can talk about the pressures that men and women face all day, but ultimately it comes down to what are you building in your own life, in your own person, in your home. And in our home, yes, we have a wage gap. My husband earns more money than me. That wasn't always true. Different phases of our life. We've had different jobs. We've arranged our household a little bit differently. But there are some families who maybe don't have a wage gap, or maybe mom's the breadwinner, right? And so all of those things are up to individual Americans. People should be free to pursue their own versions of happiness to maximize, what success looks like for them. And in the homes where people have zero wage gap, mom and dad might earn the same amount. They might share the household duties more equally. In households where women have more flexibility, maybe they take on a lion's share of childcare. Maybe for many women and mothers, they wouldn't have it any other way. Maybe they prefer to spend that time with their children, particularly if they're an infant or they require breastfeeding or whatever the choices are that individual people want to make. And I think that maybe the sort of my conclusion from this conversation is let's let people make those choices without putting pressure on women to stack up to men. I mean, that's what this whole wage gap statistic is. It's taking men, in particular white men, as the standard and saying, where do you fall according to this standard? Maybe that's not the standard that we should be holding women to, that we should be holding people across our economy too. People are not groups, people are individuals. They work together as homes and families. They make choices depending on their life circumstance, depending on the resources they have, the cards they've been dealt. They do the best with what they have. And some of these choices are very hard. I don't want to breeze over the fact that people make different choices and it's all a cakewalk. Some of these choices can be very hard. And the pandemic made a lot of these choices even harder for a lot of families. But I'm not here to tell people how they should live their lives. And I don't think that, people on the progressive left should be saying that if I fail to earn the same amount of money as my husband, that I'm somehow a bad actor because I'm contributing to this silly statistic that we talk about a lot today. So that's sort of my conclusion is people are going to make choices. There are many factors that fuel the wage gap. The wage gap is, interesting. It might tell us a few things. It certainly isn't a metric of discrimination. It's also not proof that there is no discrimination taking place, but it's just it's really not that helpful in terms of measuring women and men in our economy. We should focus our measurements and we should focus our public policy, advocacy, and solutions on equal opportunities and not equal outcomes.
Ooh, I like that. Kelsey,
Yeah.
what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, to echo what Hadley just said, I think we need to consider very closely the unintended consequences that can come from pushing this gender wage gap myth. Ultimately, worst case scenario, I fear that these types of proposals that we're hearing from the left, the Paycheck Fairness Act, AB 5, the PRO Act, these are more examples of more government regulations for work, dictating when and how you must work. My fear is that these types of proposals will ultimately not empower women, but disempower them and ultimately drive many of us from the workplace. Because I have to be perfectly honest with you all speaking here today as a mom of two young children. If I had the choice between going to work, working very long days and having to commute on top of that, or not working at all, the choice would probably be easy for me to physically be present with my children. I'm very grateful for a flexible economy that allows me to make personal choices and discuss one-on-one with my employer what works for me in terms of my day and my career. That's what more women and men need in order to fulfill ourselves personally and also in order to drive our economy. We want happy workers, we want fulfilled workers, and that means giving workers more choice.
Absolutely. Well, my 2 cents, to take off from where you left off, Kelsey, is to give women more choices. And that empowers them to be able to negotiate for what they want in the jobs. We also have to recognize that there are other regulatory barriers that keep women from having any choices whatsoever. I mean, I think about occupational licensing. You talked about AB 5 and misclassification of workers, laws that are meant to reclassify them as employees. But then there are just some occupations that skilled people who may not have degrees, who may be new to this country, who may have criminal records, still can't get into the workforce because because of the regulatory requirements that are just high bars that are hard to hop over. And so I think when we think about policy, we're able to give women flexibility, to give them greater choices, greater access to different types of opportunities when government is scaling back those unnecessary, excessive regulations, whether you're talking about licensing or you're talking about unnecessary reclassification laws, or paycheck fairness, which, is just greater scrutiny by the government with no consideration for the impacts on the individual. That's how, when we're scaling back government, I do believe, and I agree with you guys, I believe that's how we can empower women. And this is true not just for educated women with college degrees. This is true for women who don't have college degrees. This is true for women who are in the immigrant community, women who are low income, working poor families, women who are elderly or older in their careers, people who sometimes some policies are targeted at, others forget. But accessing opportunity means giving her, the individual, helping her to realize her personal agency. And when we think about young women, when I talk to them, I tell them, hey, listen, understand, if you love caregiving, if you love pre-K, if you love teaching, that is phenomenal. But also recognize what your student loan may look like if you have to take it out, and what your first year salary, your 5-year salary, and your 10-year salary may be if you pursue that. And if fulfillment is what you're going for, by all means do it. But we also recognize that you may have to make a trade-off when it comes to what your earnings are. So in any case, thank you, ladies, for backing me up, coming in. You brought the firepower today. I loved it. I loved it. Thank you so much for joining this policy chat. Thank you, Hadley, Kelsey, and Charlotte for joining us today. And hey, everybody out there, thank you for tuning into our March policy chat. We will be back next month. We may be talking about taxes, and I wonder why. April, taxes, tax day. But if you like this policy chat, we would love to hear from you. Please be sure to sign up for our newsletter at iwf.org/CEO. We are the CEO, the Center for Economic Opportunity. Again, my name is Patrice Onwuka. I'm the director of the CEO, and we are happy that you tuned in today. We hope that you will be fulfilled, that you will find purpose, and that you will find plenty of opportunities. Thanks so much.